Let your body settle now. Feel the surface beneath you holding your weight completely, taking all of it, asking nothing in return. Let your shoulders drop just a little further than you thought they could. Let your jaw unclench. Let your breath find its own rhythm. In through the nose, slow, and out through the mouth, slower still. You do not need to do anything with the next few minutes except receive this. Just receive it. There is a story that almost everyone knows. A planet dies. A child is placed in a small vessel by parents who understood that love sometimes looks like letting go. The vessel crosses an impossible distance and lands in a field in the middle of a country that believes in fresh starts. The child grows. The child becomes something the world has no accurate word for. He is strong in ways that physics cannot fully account for. He is kind in ways that history rarely produces. He becomes, in the most literal sense available to the English language, a man of steel. Not because he cannot be wounded, but because he chooses every single morning to stand between the wound and the world. This is the foundation. Sit with it for a moment before we go anywhere else. The reason the story of Superman endures, across decades, across reinventions, across every revision and reboot, and reimagining the comics industry has attempted, is not because he is powerful. Power is easy to write. Power is everywhere. The reason the story endures is because of what he does with it. He does not rule. He does not hoard. He does not decide that the world deserves what it gets. He chooses, in the face of every reason not to help. And that choice, that specific, daily, unrewarded, often thankless choice, is what makes every dark version of Superman so deeply affecting. Because every corrupted Superman begins in the same place. Every Ultraman, every regime Superman, every Red Sun, every infected and broken and twisted version of the character starts from the same seed. The same loss, the same impossible crossing, the same field in Kansas, the same farm. What changes is the soil the seed falls into. What changes is the first lesson the child learns about what strength is for. You may have grown up with a version of Superman. You may have read him in comics, watched him on a television screen, sat in a dark theatre as John Williams' theme swelled, and something in your chest responded before your brain could weigh in on whether it was appropriate to feel moved by a man in a cape. That response is not embarrassing. It is accurate. It is your nervous system recognizing something real, the outline of a moral architecture that most of us were taught to want before we had words for wanting it. The protector, the one who arrives when nothing else can. The one who holds the line not because he has to, but because someone has to, and he is the one who can. Now breathe in slowly, and breathe out. Kal-El of Krypton, Clark Kent of Smallville, Superman of Metropolis, the same person held in 3 different frames, each frame emphasizing something different. Krypton reminds us where he came from. A civilization of extraordinary achievement that could not save itself, that sent its last son forward as a message in a bottle. Smallville reminds us who raised him, the quiet, deliberate, morally serious people who understood that what they were shaping was not just a child, but a responsibility. And Metropolis reminds us who he chose to be. Not a king, not a general, not a god holding court above the clouds, but a reporter. A man who goes looking for the truth and then tells it. This is not an accident. The original creators understood something that took decades of scholarship to articulate, that the deepest threat to a person of Superman's capability is not their enemies. It is their own judgment. The moment Clark Kent stops being Clark Kent, stops being the person who waits in line and pays for his groceries and watches the news with a kind of ache because he cannot be everywhere at once, is the moment the balance tips. The civilian life is not a disguise. It is a tether. It keeps him connected to the texture of ordinary human experience. It keeps him in the world rather than above it. Every evil Superman is, at the root, a Superman who lost his tether. Some lose it through grief, some lose it through isolation, some never had it to begin with, raised on a world where power was not something you held in trust for others, but something you accumulated against them. Some are infected, some are deceived, some make a single choice, in a single terrible moment that cannot be unmade, and then spend the rest of their existence constructing a justification for that choice that grows larger and more elaborate with every passing year until it fills the entire sky and there is no longer any room in it for doubt. We are going to spend time with each of them. We are going to sit with the specific tragedy of each version, because they are all tragic, even the ones that present themselves as triumphant, even the ones who have convinced themselves they have won. Because what they have won is not a world. It is a cage they built and then climbed inside and called a throne. Let your breathing slow a little more now. There's nothing you need to solve tonight. There is nowhere you need to be. This story is already fully formed. It has been waiting for you, and all you need to do is let it move through you like water moving through a quiet channel. The original Superman, the one in primary colours, the one the world built its affection around, is not naive. This is a common misreading, and it is worth correcting before we go further. He is not naive because he chooses goodness. He chooses goodness because he has looked at the alternative with the full force of his intelligence and found it insufficient. He has held the world in his hands, literally, and understood that the difference between holding something and crushing it is not a question of strength. It is a question of character. What follows in the segments ahead is the story of what happens when the character fails, when the grief is too large, when the isolation becomes permanent, when the lesson learned in childhood was the wrong lesson, delivered by the wrong hands, on a world that did not deserve the child it received. We will meet supermen who ruled, and supermen who broke, and supermen who became the very thing they were created to oppose. Each one is a mirror. Each one is asking, in its own way, the same question. What would you become if you had all of this, and then lost the thing that made it bearable? Let that question settle in you gently, like a stone dropped into still water. Watch the rings move outward. Let them go. Tonight you are safe. Tonight you are held. Tonight you're exactly where you are meant to be, and all the weight of everything you carry has permission to set itself down beside you and rest. The story is just beginning, and it will carry you all the way home. The original Action Comics debut in 1938 placed Superman in a world that needed him for very specific reasons. Depression-era America was not an abstract backdrop. It was a texture, a weight, the specific quality of a society that had watched its own promises fail, that had seen the systems it trusted reveal their fragility, that was looking for something that worked without conditions or fine print. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster gave it that. A man who could not be corrupted, not because corruption was impossible in his world, but because the specific thing that corruption requires, the gap between what you present and what you are, had been closed in him. What you see is what is there, no distance between the costume and the person inside it. The Kent farm in almost every version of the story is rendered with a specific quality of light. Not the harsh, overexposed brightness of American optimism at its most aggressive, but something quieter, the quality of late afternoon in a place where the horizon is very far away, and there is time in the evenings to think about things that do not have immediate practical applications. Jonathan Kent, in the iterations that take him seriously as a character, is not a simple man. He is a man who thought carefully about what he was raising and what it would require. He gave his son not just love, but philosophy, the explicit, articulated understanding that power is a test that never ends, that every day presents the test again, and that passing it requires not capability, but choice. Lois Lane deserves more than a paragraph in this accounting, because her role in the architecture of Clark Kent's goodness is structural rather than decorative. She's not a prize. She is not the woman who rewards the hero. She's the person who challenges him, who refuses to be dazzled by what he can do when who he is still has room for improvement, who sees Clark Kent and Superman simultaneously and loves neither one more than the other, because she has understood that they are not two things but one. Her presence in his life is the externalization of his own moral seriousness, the daily encounter with a person who holds him to the same standards he holds himself without asking permission. And then there is Metropolis itself. The city is not incidental to the Superman mythology. It is functional, a living system of several million ordinary people conducting the full range of human experience in compressed proximity, a world unto itself that requires not just protection, but participation. The city teaches him, continuously, what human life actually looks like from inside rather than from above. The Daily Planet is not just a job, it is an education in the specific gravity of other people's stories, the way every person carries a world behind their eyes that is as complete and as weighted as any other. Clark Kent the reporter is Clark Kent the student of humanity, and the education is ongoing, and it is the reason Superman remains connected to what he is protecting, rather than simply hovering above it. There is a scene that recurs across Superman adaptations in various forms, and it is worth naming because it illuminates something that the more dramatic moments of the mythology tend to overshadow. Clark Kent is in the newsroom. He is sitting at his desk in his slightly ill-fitting suit, with his glasses and his deliberate ordinariness. He is filing a story about city council zoning, or infrastructure funding, or a labour dispute, something that will be read by people who will never know that the man who wrote it could have been elsewhere, could have been anywhere. He is there, at that desk, doing that work because it matters, because the story matters, because the world is made of these ordinary things, and if you stop paying attention to the ordinary things, you stop belonging to the world that needs you. The decision to make Superman a journalist is the most underrated creative choice in the character's history. Not a soldier, not a scientist, not a politician. A journalist. A person whose professional purpose is to pay attention, to witness, to translate what is observed into language that other people can receive and use. Every day that Clark Kent shows up at the Daily Planet, he is practicing the art of translation, the specific discipline of taking something true and making it legible to people who are not present for it. This discipline keeps him human in ways that the cape and the powers cannot, because the cape operates in the register of the extraordinary. The notebook operates in the register of the real. The Superman mythology also contains embedded within it a quiet meditation on what it means to be trusted, not feared, not obeyed, trusted. The distinction is one that most of the Dark Supermen collapse, treating compliance as evidence of trust and the absence of opposition as evidence of approval. But trust is something different. It is what exists when a person has the power to harm you, and you are confident they will not because you have no choice, but because you have enough evidence of their character to extend them the benefit of the doubt. The people of Metropolis trust Superman. This is the foundation of everything else, and it is not given. It is accumulated slowly, through the endless accumulation of moments in which he had the opportunity to choose differently and did not. CTA. If this is landing softly, go ahead and subscribe so the next story is already waiting when you return. Leave a comment below telling me where in the world you're listening from. I read every one. Now let's continue. Breathe in and out. Feel the weight of your body, the gentle pull of rest drawing you further down with each exhale. You're safe here. The story will come to you. You do not have to chase it. There is a version of grief that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with the dramatic gestures of cinematic sorrow. It does not collapse onto its knees in the rain, does not scream at the sky. It arrives quietly, in the hours after the thing that cannot be undone has already been undone, and it sits down inside the person it has found, and it begins, very carefully, to rearrange the furniture, to shift the walls, to alter the angles of everything the person thought they understood about the world and their place in it, until the interior space that remains is recognizable in its dimensions, but no longer navigable in the ways it once was. This is the grief that found Clark Kent on the day Lois Lane died, and it is important to understand, before anything else about the Injustice story, that the loss was not simple. It was not just the loss of a person he loved, though it was that completely. It was the loss of the anchor. Lois Lane, in the architecture of Clark's identity, served the same function as Smallville, as the Daily Planet, as the ordinary human life he maintained with such deliberate care. She was the reason he stayed. Not just stayed on Earth, stayed human, stayed humble, stayed in the posture of a person who belongs to the world rather than over it. When she died, something else died with her. Something quieter, and in the long run, more consequential. The Injustice universe begins with a manipulation so precise it reads almost as an experiment. The Joker, who has always understood that his war with Batman is a losing one, turns his attention to Superman instead, recognizing that the Man of Steel is, paradoxically, more vulnerable than the Dark Knight, because Superman still has things to lose. He has a world he loves. He has a woman he loves. He has a future he is building toward. The Joker understands that these are not strengths. In the right hands, at the right moment, they are levers. What he engineers is a sequence of events too precise to be survived intact. Lois dies, and in dying she triggers the destruction of Metropolis. And in that destruction, something in Clark's moral framework, the part that had always understood restraint not as weakness but as respect, does not bend. It breaks. Clean through, the way things break when they have been holding too much for too long and the final weight arrives without warning. He kills the Joker. Let that sit for a moment. Not because the act is indefensible in the emotional logic of the moment. Grief has its own physics, and in the seconds after a loss of that scale, the ordinary moral calculations do not apply in ordinary ways, but because of what the act means structurally. Because Superman has always been the one who does not do this, the one who carries criminals to justice rather than delivering justice himself, the one who has, on multiple occasions, allowed himself to be harmed rather than cross the line that separates protection from punishment. The Joker has always survived precisely because Superman is Superman. When that survival ends, the line ends with it. And the world notices what follows in the Injustice narrative is not a story of a tyrant who never cared. That would be simpler and less interesting. It is a story of a man who cared so much that, when his capacity to protect was overwhelmed, he decided that protection itself needed to be redefined. If the world produces people capable of the Joker, capable of engineering a loss of that scale and then laughing about it, then perhaps the world cannot be trusted to govern itself. Perhaps what it needs is not a protector but an administrator, not someone who holds the line, but someone who draws new lines and enforces them absolutely. This is the logic of every benevolent tyrant who has ever existed, and it is worth noticing, in the quiet of this moment, that the logic is not entirely wrong. That is what makes it so effective as a story, and so recognizable as a human pattern. The wrongness is not in the diagnosis. The wrongness is in the conclusion. The wrongness is in the assumption that enough power, applied with enough sincerity, can make suffering optional. Breathe out slowly. Let your body settle a little deeper. The Injustice Superman builds an organization called the One Earth Regime. He ends wars. He stabilizes governments. He establishes a peace that is genuine, in the sense that the absence of active conflict is genuine. People are not dying in the numbers they were dying before, and this is real, and it matters, and it is not nothing. But the peace is also the peace of surveillance and compliance, and the understanding shared by every person alive. That disagreement beyond a certain threshold is not permitted. That the man in the sky is watching. That the man in the sky has decided, based on his own experience of loss, what the world is allowed to do with its freedom. Batman opposes him. This is almost unbearably poignant if you sit with it. The two oldest friends in DC Comics, the two heroes most responsible for each other's longevity in the culture, standing on opposite sides of the most fundamental disagreement available. Bruce Wayne, who has no powers and has always operated in the dark, insisting on the dignity of human self-determination. Clark Kent, who has every power and now stands in the light of his own authority, insisting that self-determination is a luxury the world has not earned. And here is where the modern Echo arrives softly. You know both of them. You've grown up with both of them. You know what Bruce lost in that alley in Gotham, and you know what Clark lost in that field in Kansas, and you understand, somewhere beneath the level of conscious analysis, that both of them have been shaped by loss into something that resembles heroism from most angles, but that contains, in each version, a specific wound that never fully healed. What Injustice does is show you what happens when the wound opens again, with no one left to close it. The Injustice Superman is not a villain. This is the most important thing to understand about him, and the most uncomfortable. He is a man who loved the world, lost the person who made the world bearable, and then decided to make the world worthy of the love he can no longer direct at a single person. He spreads it everywhere. He makes it mandatory, and in doing so he becomes the thing he was always capable of becoming. Not because he was always going to, but because the specific sequence of events that found him was precise enough and devastating enough to undo the work of a lifetime. This is what every dark Superman teaches, in one form or another. That goodness is not a destination you arrive at and then maintain passively. It is a practice, a daily return to a set of values that have to be chosen again and again and again, especially on the days when choosing them cost the most. The Injustice Superman stopped choosing, not out of malice, out of exhaustion, out of a grief so complete that the only thing that felt equal to it was absolute control. Rest now. Let your breath come slow and easy. You understand this story not because you have experienced what he experienced, but because you understand, in your own smaller and more human scale, what it is to reach for control when everything else feels uncertain. What it is to want desperately to make the world stop hurting long enough to catch your breath. He just had the power to try, and that made all the difference. The city of Metropolis itself, in the months following the regime's establishment, changed in ways that were subtle and then not subtle. Not the physical infrastructure. Superman maintained that with something close to obsessive care, understanding that the appearance of a functioning, prosperous city was essential to the narrative he needed the world to believe. What changed was the quality of public speech. The newspapers found new editorial instincts. The broadcast journalists developed a particular skill for emphasis, for knowing which questions to ask and which to let pass unremarked. Not because anyone had told them to, because the atmosphere communicated it. Because the air itself carried information about what kinds of words produced, what kinds of consequences, and people are in general much faster at learning this than any formal directive could accomplish. It is worth spending a moment with the specific mechanics of how the Joker identified Lois as the key, because this is not a random act of destruction, and treating it as one misses something important about what the Injustice narrative understands about Superman's psychology. The Joker has always been a student of his opponents. He has spent years in the proximity of Batman, studying the shape of his obsessions, mapping the architecture of his trauma. And what he observed in Superman, in the specific way Clark Kent's behaviour changed in Lois Lane's presence, in the quality of attention he gave her, in the way his extraordinary vigilance relaxed slightly when she was near, was not love as a vulnerability in the sentimental sense. It was love as the load-bearing wall of an entire moral structure. Remove Lois, and you do not simply cause grief. You remove the thing that all of it was built around. The Justice League's response to the formation of the regime is itself a portrait of how communities fracture under pressure. Not all at once, not cleanly. The fracturing happens in stages, small compromises, individual calculations, the private weighing of what you believe against what is practical given who you are up against. Some heroes join the regime early, convinced by Superman's logic, or by the evidence of its effectiveness, or simply by the recognition that opposition carries costs they are not prepared to pay. Others resist and are dealt with. Others go underground and fight the kind of slow, grinding, unglamorous resistance that leaves no room for the certainties that made heroism feel clean in the old world. Cyborg, Shazam, Hal Jordan, each of their choices in the Injustice continuity is a case study in how a person of goodwill ends up on the wrong side of a moral line by taking one small step at a time, each individual step defensible in its immediate context. The Injustice comics, written by Tom Taylor and subsequently by other hands, are remarkable for the consistency with which they refuse to make the regime Superman monstrous in his private moments. In the quieter scenes, and there are quiet scenes even in this narrative, he is recognisable. He still grieves. He still carries the specific weight of what he lost, and the weight has not become easier with the passage of time and the accumulation of power. If anything, the power has made it heavier, because power has given him the ability to make the world safer, and the world's safety has not made him feel safe. The wound is not in the world. The wound is in him. And no administrative achievement, however genuine its benefits, reaches the wound. What the Injustice story ultimately reveals is something that political philosophy has been examining for centuries, and that fiction keeps needing to restate because the lesson keeps needing to be relearned. That the legitimacy of a system is not established by its outcomes alone. A system that produces good outcomes through coercion is not a good system. It is a successful coercion. And successful coercion, however well-intentioned, creates a world in which the difference between safety and imprisonment becomes a matter of the coercer's continued goodwill, which is not a stable foundation for anything. The regime is one bad day for Superman away from becoming something far worse than what it already is, and everyone living inside it knows this, even the ones who publicly support it. Even the ones who have convinced themselves that what they feel is gratitude rather than a managed and careful compliance. CTA, if this story is resonating with you, subscribe. There are 9 more segments waiting, each one going deeper. Drop your location in the comments. I love knowing where these words are landing. Feel the heaviness in your limbs now, that pleasant settling weight that comes when the body finally accepts that the day is done and the night belongs to it. Let it spread from your shoulders down through your arms, your hands, your fingers. Let it move through your chest and down through your hips, your legs, all the way to the soles of your feet. You are heavy, and heavy is good, and heavy means rest. Every story needs its mirror. This is not a literary device so much as a philosophical necessity. You cannot fully understand what something is until you have seen what it is not an absence, but an active opposite, a version of the thing that shares its shape while inverting its meaning. In the architecture of DC Comics, that mirror has a name, and it has existed in various forms since the early 1960s, when writers first asked the question that would echo through decades of storytelling. What if the rocket had landed somewhere else, and the child inside it had been taught the opposite lesson? The place is called Earth 3. The world it contains is identical to our own in almost every measurable respect. The same continents, the same weather patterns, the same approximate distribution of human population across the same approximate land masses. But the moral gravity runs in reverse. Where our world produced heroes, Earth 3 produced their counterparts. Where Jonathan and Martha Kent found a child and chose to raise it with gentleness and deliberate care, the people who found the Kryptonian infant on Earth 3 looked at what he was, at the power already resident in that small body, at the potential written into every cell, and they taught him what they believed the world had taught them. That strength is not a gift. It is a weapon, and weapons are for winning. Sit with that for a moment. The same child, the same impossible crossing, the same field, or something like it. Different hands. Ultraman has Superman's face. He has Superman's body, his powers, the complete physical catalogue of abilities that make Kal-El one of the most formidable beings in the multiverse. What he does not have is the restraint, the humour, the specific quality of warmth that Clark Kent carries like a second set of clothes. The warmth that comes from having been a child among children, from having known what it is to be ordinary before discovering what it is to be extraordinary. On Earth 3, Ultraman leads the crime syndicate of America. The names of his companions are inversions. Owlman, where our world has Batman, Superwoman, where our world has Wonder Woman, Power Ring, where our world has the Green Lantern. They are a team in the same structural sense that the Justice League is a team, but the purpose is inverted entirely. The League exists to protect the world from threats. The Syndicate exists to ensure that the world understands who its threats are, namely, them. The dynamic within the Syndicate is worth sitting with, because it reveals something about Ultraman that is less obvious from the outside. He does not rule through affection. He rules through the only currency Earth 3 has ever taught him to trust, which is the credible threat of overwhelming force. His colleagues do not respect him in the sense of admiring his qualities. They respect him in the sense of calculating constantly whether challenging him would cost more than it is worth. This is a particular kind of loneliness that Ultraman would never name as loneliness, because naming it would require acknowledging a need, and acknowledging a need would require acknowledging a vulnerability, and vulnerability on Earth 3 is a thing that gets used against you before you have finished identifying it. There is a detail in various Ultraman stories that lands quietly and stays. He is addicted to kryptonite. On our Earth, kryptonite is the one substance capable of harming Superman, the mineral residue of a dead planet that can bring the most powerful being alive to his knees. For Ultraman, the relationship is reversed. Kryptonite amplifies his power. He consumes it, seeks it, hoards it. Not because he enjoys the feeling, though the stories suggest he does, but because on a world where strength is the only reliable protection, more strength is always the rational goal. This is the addiction of a person who was never allowed to feel safe. The accumulation of power as a proxy for the security that intimacy and trust might otherwise provide, if either of those things had ever been modelled for him as real options. Let your breath come slow now, in and out. The air is cool and the room is quiet and you're entirely, completely safe. When Ultraman crosses into our universe, as he has in various configurations of the Crisis and Forever Evil storylines, something interesting happens. He is still formidable. He's still capable of overwhelming most of the opposition he encounters, but he is also, for the first time, in a world that has a Superman, and the contrast is not merely physical, it is atmospheric. People in our world respond to Superman with something that Ultraman genuinely cannot pass, because he has never encountered it before. Trust. Freely given, not coerced. The specific quality of trust that exists between a protector and the protected when the relationship has been built over time through consistent, undemanding care. Ultraman finds this baffling, then threatening, then enraging. Because it points to the one thing Earth 3 never gave him, the evidence that it was possible for strength to be used any other way than the way he uses it. This is where the modern Echo arrives. You know Clark Kent. You have seen what he built. Not just the feats, not just the saves and the battles and the impossible moments of physical heroism, but the texture of his daily life, the way he holds doors and listens to people and maintains his humanity in a world that regularly gives him reasons to stop bothering. You know what that life looks like. And so when you meet Ultraman, you're not just meeting an enemy. You're meeting the specific shape of an unlived life. The answer to the question, what if none of that had ever been offered to him? The philosophers who study moral development have a term for what Earth 3 produced in Ultraman. They call it a failure of moral imagination. not the absence of the capacity to conceive of other people's interior lives, but the systematic suppression of that capacity, trained out of a person so early and so completely that its absence feels like common sense rather than deprivation. He does not know what he is missing. That is not an excuse. But it is an explanation, and in the quiet of a night like this one, explanations matter more than verdicts. The crime syndicate's Earth 3 eventually falls, in most of the stories that involve it. The causes vary. Internal conflict, external incursion, the accumulated weight of a world built on pure coercion finally collapsing under its own unsustainable logic. A world that runs on fear is a world that is always one unchecked moment away from its own unravelling. Ultraman survives these collapses in most versions, because survival is the one skill Earth 3 taught him with absolute thoroughness. What he does not do in any version is change. Not because change is impossible. The stories that involve character development know that change is always possible, given the right conditions. But because the right conditions have never arrived for him, and there is no one in his orbit whose job it is to offer them, and he would not recognise them if they did. The shape he was pressed into is the shape he has occupied for so long that it no longer feels like a shape. It feels like the truth of who he is. This is the quietest tragedy in the Ultraman story. Not the violence, which is extensive, not the megalomania, which is thorough, but the sealed quality of it. The sense of a person permanently installed in a version of themselves that was never chosen, only inherited. Rest now. Let your thoughts go soft at the edges. The story will continue. You do not need to hold it. The Crime Syndicate's version of the Justice League roster is worth sitting with in some detail, because the inversions are not random. Each member represents a specific failure mode of their heroic counterpart, not simply an evil version, but the precise negative image of what makes the original who they are. Owlman, the Batman analogue, takes the Dark Knight's relentless rationalism to its logical extreme, arriving at a nihilism so thoroughgoing that it becomes its own form of madness. Where Batman's rationalism serves justice, Owlman serves the conclusion that justice itself is a fiction, that all choices are equally meaningless, and that the only intellectually honest response to this conclusion is pure self-interest pursued without apology. Superwoman, the Wonder Woman analogue in the Syndicate, is among the most complex inversions, because Wonder Woman's heroism is built on a foundation of genuine compassion and the specific Amazonian understanding of strength as something that exists to protect rather than to dominate. Superwoman inverts this not by being weak, but by being strong in exactly the same way, and using that strength to dominate rather than protect. She is not a victim of her world any more than Ultraman is. She is a beneficiary of it. A person who looked at the options available in a world organised around power and chose, entirely freely and with full awareness, the option that served her most directly. What the Crime Syndicate collectively represents is not simply evil heroism, it is the proof of concept that the Justice League's model is a choice rather than an inevitability. Given the same raw material, comparable powers, comparable intelligence, comparable exposure to a world full of ordinary people in need of something they cannot provide for themselves, a group of people can arrive at an entirely different conclusion about what their capabilities are for. The Syndicate is the argument that the League's generosity is not natural. It is cultivated. It is maintained through effort. It is the product of specific influences and specific relationships and specific formative experiences that could, in a different world, have gone differently. Ultraman's relationship to kryptonite as an amplifier rather than a poison is also, in the reading that most rewards the effort, a comment on the nature of trauma and its uses. The thing that harms the version of himself that could have been, the radiation of his own dead homeworld, he has transformed into fuel. He has found a way to take the most fundamental reminder of what he lost and what he never had and convert it into raw capability. This is not the healthiest possible relationship to loss, but it is an intensely human one. The conversion of wound into weapon, the way grief hardens into something that can be pointed outward. Ultraman did not invent this pattern. He simply has the power to scale it in ways that make it impossible to ignore. The geography of Earth 3 is worth pausing on briefly, because the physical world reflects its moral inversion in ways that the stories occasionally make visible. Cities that are recognizable but wrong. Gotham City as a place of order and comfort, Metropolis as a place of danger and darkness, create an environment in which the physical landscape itself functions as a kind of moral commentary. When Ultraman looks out over the skyline of his metropolis, he sees a city organized around the reality of power, where the strong occupy the high floors and the weak are in the shadows below, and this strikes him not as unjust but as simply accurate. A city that is honest about what cities actually are, rather than maintaining the polite fiction that the arrangement of bodies in space is anything other than the visible expression of the arrangement of power in a society. The crime syndicate's mythology also contains, in its more developed iterations, a creation story for Earth 3 itself, an account of how a world comes to be organized around fear and domination rather than cooperation and mutual protection. The story, in various tellings, suggests that the moral inversion of Earth 3 is not simply the absence of heroes. It is the active presence of something that defeated heroism at the foundational level. A world in which every attempt to establish the kind of trust and cooperation that makes a society functional was met with betrayal early enough and thoroughly enough that the lesson calcified into doctrine. Earth 3 is not evil because evil won there. It is evil because trust lost repeatedly, until the loss became the defining fact of the world's self-understanding. CTA. Subscribe if you want to stay in this world a little longer. The next segments go even deeper into the lore, and leave a comment. What time is it where you are right now? I'm always curious. Settle in a little deeper now. Feel the stillness of the room around you, the quiet that has been here all along, waiting underneath the noise of the day. It does not need anything from you. Neither does this story. It is already complete. All you have to do is let it arrive. There is a thought experiment that sits at the heart of one of the most celebrated alternate Superman stories ever told. It is simple enough to state in a single sentence, and complex enough to spend an entire lifetime unpacking. The sentence is this: what if the rocket had been 12 hours slower? 12 hours. The Earth rotates once every 24. A 12-hour delay in landing puts the vessel not in a field in Kansas, but in a field in Soviet Ukraine, circa 1938. The child is still the same child. The power is still the same power. But the hands that reach into the craft, the faces that look down at the infant with the blue eyes, and the impossible physical stillness of a being already beginning to understand its own difference, those hands belong to collective farm workers, not American farmers. The first language those ears hear is not English. The first lesson about what a person owes to other people comes not from a family operating in the tradition of individual dignity and personal responsibility, but from a system that has decided, at the state level, that the individual is a unit of collective function. The child grows up as a ward of Stalin's Soviet Union. He is the Superman of the USSR. He is the most powerful being on Earth, and he is a communist. Not cynically, not as a performance, but genuinely, in the way that people are genuinely shaped by the ideological water they swim in from birth. He believes in the collective. He believes that the purpose of strength is the elevation of the group. He believes, with the sincere and somewhat heartbreaking conviction of someone who has never had reason to question his foundational assumptions, that the Soviet system represents the highest expression of human potential, and that his role is to protect and extend it. Mark Millar's Red Sun is the story of this Superman across several decades, and it is one of the most politically sophisticated things the superhero genre has produced. It does not tell the story of a hero who turns evil. It tells the story of a hero who never had access to the specific cultural inputs that, on our Earth, produced the particular character of Clark Kent, the humility, the deference, the deep suspicion of his own judgment that keeps him from ever deciding that he knows better than the people he serves. The Soviet Superman begins with genuine restraint. He does not initially seek to expand Soviet power beyond its existing sphere. He is protective rather than aggressive, and the protection is real. He saves people, feeds populations, prevents industrial disasters on a scale that no human workforce could match. For a time, he is simply an extraordinary public servant, and the relationship between him and the people he serves has something in it of the warmth that Clark Kent maintained with Metropolis. What erodes this is not a single event, but a slow accumulation of disillusionment. The Soviet system, observed from the inside by someone with superhuman perception, is not what it claims to be. The gap between the ideology and the practice is vast and worsening. The leadership is corrupt in ways that grow more elaborate and harder to ignore with each passing year. And Superman faces the choice that every idealist eventually faces within a flawed institution. Do you leave, or do you stay, and try to fix it from within? He stays, and in staying he begins to accrue responsibility, and in accruing responsibility he begins to make decisions, and in making decisions he begins to notice that the decisions he makes are better, more efficient, more humane, more genuinely beneficial than the decisions the existing system produces. And this observation, arrived at honestly and confirmed repeatedly by direct evidence, begins to do something to his understanding of his own role. Breathe in slowly and let it go. By the middle sections of the Red Sun story, Superman has effectively become the state. Not through a coup, not through violence, but through the quiet, incremental, entirely rational-seeming process of filling every gap that human incompetence and corruption leave open, until the gaps are gone, and what remains is a system that functions because he is its function. The Soviet Union under his stewardship becomes an extraordinary administrative achievement. Poverty essentially eliminated, disease controlled, international conflict minimized. By some measures, it is the best governed territory in human history. But Lex Luthor, here reimagined as an American genius working to counter Soviet expansion, identifies the problem with surgical precision. He identifies it because he understands something about Superman that Superman has not yet understood about himself. The system works because Superman is the system. There is no redundancy, no distributed authority, no institutional memory that exists independently of the man at its centre. If Superman changes his mind, if his values shift, if his judgment fails, if something breaks in him, there is no check, there is no court of appeal, there is no other entity with the standing or the capacity to say, no, not this. What Luthor builds, in Red Sun, is not a weapon against Superman. It is an argument. A long, costly, brilliantly constructed argument that the most dangerous thing on Earth is not an evil man with power, but a good man with too much of it and no one left to question him. The modern echo's quiet here, but unmistakable. You know, Lex Luthor. In most versions of the story, he is the villain, the small, brilliant, envious man who cannot accept that someone exists who is simply better than him. But Red Sun asks you to sit with a different version of Luthor, a version who might be right about the specific thing he's most insistent about, even if his methods for proving it are themselves morally complex. It asks you to hold both things at once, that Superman's intentions are good, and that good intentions administered at scale without accountability produce their own form of harm. The ending of Red Sun is one of the most quietly devastating reversals in comic book history. It does not resolve with a battle, it resolves with a letter, with the discovery that the story has been longer and stranger and more intricate than any of its participants understood, with the recognition that even the most controlled narrative contains elements that exceed its controller's comprehension. The Soviet Superman, near the end, begins to understand what he has built. He reads a letter from a source that reframes his entire existence. And in the reading of it, something in him shifts. Not enough to undo what has been done, but enough to recognize it. That recognition is its own form of grace. Small, late, insufficient in some ways, but real. In the moral universe of these stories, recognition always matters. Even when it arrives too late to change the outcome, it changes the person, and changing the person is never nothing. Let your eyes grow heavy now. Let the story hold itself while you rest. The figure of Lex Luthor in Red Sun deserves more than passing attention, because Miller's reimagining of him is the most sympathetic and also the most genuinely frightening version of the character. In our universe, Luthor's genius is in service of his ego, his intelligence a tool of his resentment. In Red Sun, the ego is still present. Luthor is constitutionally incapable of accepting that anyone else is smarter than he is, but the intelligence is aimed at something more urgent and more legitimate. He is the defender of human self-determination. He is the one making the argument that the world needs to be saved from its savior, and the argument is correct. The Soviet Superman's relationship to the people he governs is one of the more psychologically nuanced elements of the Red Sun story. He cares about them. This is not in question. His investment in their welfare is genuine, expressed in the specific way that genuinely caring people express investment, through attention, through the allocation of effort, through the willingness to be present in difficult situations, and to personally absorb costs that could be avoided. He is not using them. He is serving them. But the service has become, over time, so total and so encompassing that its relationship to their autonomy has become something that neither he nor they fully examine, because examination would require confronting a question neither party is ready to answer. The ending of Red Sun, with its extraordinary cosmological reveal, reframes everything that preceded it in ways that are worth considering at some length. Without spoiling its specific mechanics, the ending suggests that the entire history of this alternate Superman was part of a larger arc, that the choices made, the systems built, the specific trajectory of a life organized around Soviet ideology, and the management of human affairs were themselves part of something that could be corrected not through political opposition, but through time itself. This is either deeply comforting or deeply unsettling depending on what you believe about agency and structure, and the relationship between individual choice and the larger patterns that individual choices are embedded in. Red Sun is ultimately a story about the loneliness of certainty. The Soviet Superman becomes so sure of his analysis of the world's problems, and so confident in his capacity to address them, that he loses access to the productive uncertainty that good decision-making requires. He stops being surprised. He stops encountering evidence that contradicts his model of how things work and what they need. And in losing access to surprise, he loses access to growth. The specific kind of growth that requires you to be wrong in ways you did not anticipate, and to incorporate the wrongness into your understanding of yourself. He becomes, for all his genuine accomplishment, a closed system. And closed systems, however efficient in their own terms, do not adapt. They do not evolve. They produce what they were designed to produce until the conditions that made them viable change, and then they fail. The specific detail of the rocket's 12-hour delay is worth returning to one more time before we leave Red Sun behind, because it contains within it a meditation on contingency that the story handles with remarkable restraint. 12 hours. The difference between Clark Kent of Smallville and the Soviet Superman of Red Sun is not genetic. It is not philosophical. It is not even, in the deepest sense, volitional. It is 12 hours, a slightly slower journey, a different rotation of the Earth. Everything that follows, the character, the ideology, the specific texture of a life lived in service to a collective rather than a democratic tradition, flows from a fact as arbitrary as the speed of a vessel crossing an impossible distance in the cold of space. This is not a counsel of despair. It is not an argument that character does not matter, or that the choices we make are irrelevant because contingency shapes everything anyway. It is something more nuanced. The recognition that the person we become is always partly the product of conditions we did not choose, influences we did not select, a world that arrived before we were prepared to evaluate it. This Soviet Superman did not choose his formation any more than Clark Kent chose his. What each of them did was work within the formation they were given, building toward the values they had been taught, expressing the love they had learned, protecting the things they had been shown were worth protecting. The difference is in what they were shown. The difference is in the hands that reached into the craft and lifted the child out and said, "Here, this is yours, this is home, this is what the world is and what you are for." Red Sun ends with a kind of peace, not a triumphant peace. Too much has happened for triumph to be available. But a peace that acknowledges what was, honours what was genuine in it, and allows the arc to complete. The Soviet Superman, in his final moments of clear-eyed recognition, sees the larger story he's been embedded in. He sees that his life, for all its distortions, pointed towards something true, that the love he had for the people he governed was real, that the care was real, that none of it excuses the control, the coercion, the administrative suffocation of human self-determination, but that the love underneath all of it was never in question. He loved a world, he just did not know how to let it be free. CTA, if you're still with me, subscribe. There's so much more lore ahead, and it only gets quieter and deeper. Tell me in the comments, which Superman story found you first? I'd love to know. Take a long, slow breath now. In through the nose, feeling the air cool as it enters. Out through the mouth, warm and unhurried. Your body knows how to do this. It has been doing it without your permission since the moment you arrived in the world, and it will continue long after your conscious attention has moved on to other things. All you're doing is watching it, accompanying it, riding the breath the way you might ride a current, not fighting, not steering, just moving with it. We return now to the Injustice universe, but from a different angle. We have already sat with the origin of the regime, the loss that fractured Clark Kent's moral framework and set him on the path toward governance by force. What we have not yet examined is the texture of the world he built, the daily reality of living inside it. Because the most sophisticated thing the Injustice stories do is not show you a monster. They show you something far more unsettling, a world that is, by many measurable standards, better than the one it replaced. Pause here. Let that settle. Under the One Earth regime, large-scale military conflict has effectively ceased. The wars that had defined human interaction for centuries, the border disputes and resource conflicts and ideological wars that had claimed lives in numbers the mind struggles to hold, are over. Not because humanity resolved its underlying disagreements, but because the entity capable of ending any conflict unilaterally made it known that conflict would be ended. The deterrent is absolute. The peace that results is genuine in its outcomes and entirely coerced in its mechanism. People are not dying in the numbers they were dying before. This is a real thing. The regime's Superman knows this, measures it, uses it as the foundation of his self-justification in every conversation that challenges his methods, and the number is not fabricated. The harm reduction is real. When you go looking for the moral argument against the regime, you cannot find it in the death toll, because the death toll went down. You have to find it somewhere more abstract and more difficult to articulate, which is precisely why the story is so effective and so uncomfortable. The regime's infrastructure is built on a hierarchy that Superman established and maintains. He is at the top, and below him are operatives drawn from the ranks of heroes who agreed with his assessment of the situation, or who were persuaded to agree by a combination of Superman's genuine conviction and the practical reality that disagreeing with him carries significant personal risk. Wonder Woman, in this timeline, occupies a position that is troubling precisely because of how recognizable it is. She is loyal to him, and her loyalty has become entangled with her ideology in ways she has not fully disentangled. And she does things in the name of protecting what they have built that she might not have done in the life she once inhabited. The sit-with-it moment arrives here, in the gap between what the regime intended and what it became. Because this is not a story about corruption in the ordinary sense. No one in the regime leadership is enriching themselves. No one is pursuing private agendas under cover of public service. They are, in the most technically accurate sense available, true believers. They are doing what they genuinely believe is right. And this is the thing that the political philosophers have been warning about for centuries. This is the version of the problem that is hardest to resist and hardest to dismantle once it has been established, because you cannot oppose it by pointing to the hypocrisy of its leaders. The leaders are not hypocrites, they are sincere, and sincerity, administered at scale, with overwhelming force behind it, is among the most dangerous conditions a population can find itself in. Breathe out slowly. There is nothing to solve, just receive it. Batman, in this timeline, operates as he has always operated, in the spaces between what authority can see, but the nature of his opposition has shifted. In our world, Batman fights criminals, people who have placed themselves outside the social contract and who use force against the unwilling. In the injustice world, Batman fights the government. He fights Superman. And this changes the moral framing of his vigilantism in ways that make it harder to dismiss as the pathology of a wealthy man playing dangerous games in the dark. Here it looks more like resistance. More like the specific tradition of individuals who decided that the legitimacy of a system is not established by its effectiveness, but by whether it can be questioned, challenged, and changed by the people who live inside it. The Injustice comics and games spend considerable time with the texture of ordinary life under the regime, and what emerges is not a portrait of a dystopia in the cinematic sense, not breadlines and secret police and the visible machinery of oppression. It is something quieter and in some ways more alienating. People are comfortable. People are by certain metrics flourishing. But there is an atmosphere, a specific quality of self-censorship that has settled over public discourse, a collective understanding that certain thoughts are better kept internal, certain criticisms better left unvoiced, because the man who can hear your heartbeat from orbit is not a man you want to disappoint. The modern echo arrives here in the form of something you may have felt yourself in smaller registers. The self-censorship that comes from being in a space, an institution, a relationship, a community, where the person with the most power is also the person who defined the rules and whose approval determines whether you are safe. Most of us have inhabited such spaces in limited and recoverable ways. The injustice world has scaled that experience to encompass everything. The ceiling is infinite. The space is the whole world. And the person at the top genuinely believes he is doing it for your benefit. What eventually breaks the regime is not a military victory. It is a crossing, versions of the Justice League from the primary DC universe, a Superman among them who has not walked the path his counterpart walked, who serves as living evidence that the choice the Injustice Superman made was a choice, not an inevitability. That another path existed, that the same loss in a different person, or perhaps the same person with different support around him, could have been survived without becoming this. The confrontation between the two Supermen is one of the most emotionally resonant moments in the Injustice story, not because of the physical conflict, but because of what it represents. One Clark Kent looking at another, recognizing the same face, the same history, the same foundational loss, and finding, in the mirror, not himself, but the version of himself that fear produced. The version that chose control over trust. The version that stopped believing that human beings, given the space and the support, could find their own way forward. Our Superman wins. Not because he is more powerful, in some versions of this confrontation he is not. He wins because he has people around him who remind him constantly of what he is fighting for, who hold the shape of the world he wants to protect in their own hands so that he never has to hold it alone. This is the thing the regime Superman lost before he lost everything else. Not Lois, not Metropolis, not his faith in human decency. He lost the willingness to be carried, to be held, to allow other people to share the weight of the thing he thought only he could bear. Let that go softly now. Let your body be heavy and your mind be light. The weight is not yours tonight. The Wonder Woman of the Injustice timeline occupies a position that is worth more time than most discussions of the regime allocate to it. In the primary DC continuity, Diana of Themyscira is among the most morally serious figures in the entire Justice League, a being whose commitment to justice is ancient and culture deep, rooted in an Amazonian tradition that predates most of the institutions the other heroes operate within. She does not defer to human law when human law conflicts with justice. She operates from a more primary set of principles. This makes her, in the Injustice timeline, both the regime's most philosophically consistent defender and its most uncomfortable one, because she has convinced herself that what the regime is doing is justice, and she is genuinely trying to think carefully about this, and the thinking has led her somewhere she would once have found unacceptable. She's not a hypocrite. She is wrong. These are different conditions, and the difference matters. The Injustice story also grapples in its quieter moments with what it means to be a hero who has made peace with the wrong choice. The heroes who joined the regime did not in most cases join it in bad faith. They joined it because they believed the arguments Superman was making, or because they were afraid of what opposing him would cost, which is its own form of honest calculation. The ones who joined because they were afraid are the most human in some ways, because fear is the most available response to overwhelming force. They did not become villains. They became people who made an accommodation they will have to live with, and the living with is its own sustained moral consequence. The geography of the Injustice world's moral landscape is not a simple binary between those who support the regime and those who oppose it. What exists in between is a vast middle territory populated by people who are doing what people in such circumstances have always done, accommodating, making the small adjustments to behaviour and expression that allow them to live in safety, not endorsing exactly, not resisting certainly, moving through the world with the careful legibility of someone who has learned which things can be said and which cannot, not from a directive but from the ambient information that the world provides about what happens to people who are not sufficiently careful. Green Arrow's role in the Injustice narrative is among the most quietly affecting, because Oliver Queen is among the characters who pays the highest personal cost for opposition in the earlier stages of the regime's establishment, before the full apparatus of coercion is in place, when the choices being made are still somewhat reversible, when what is being built could still be dismantled if enough people decided together that it should be. His death is not a dramatic turning point in the narrative. It is a data point. It tells everyone watching what the cost of visibility is, and most of them, doing the calculation that most people do in such situations, decide that the cost is too high. The regime's treatment of Gotham City, which Batman refuses to cede to regime authority, maintaining it as a de facto independent space under his protection, is one of the more interesting geopolitical details in the Injustice world. Gotham exists as a kind of enclave, a space where the older understanding of justice still operates, where the question of whether it is appropriate to use overwhelming force to impose order has not been settled in the regime's favour. It is dark, and it is dangerous, and it is governed by a man in a bat costume working with severely limited resources. And somehow, it is freer than any place Superman controls directly. The irony of this, that the city most associated with fear and violence is the one where self-determination survives, is not lost on the narrative. One of the most revealing moments in the extended Injustice storyline comes when Superman is asked directly, by someone he respects and who has served the regime faithfully, whether he would ever be willing to step back, to relinquish authority. to return decision-making to the institutions and the people who held it before he intervened. His answer is not a refusal. It is something more complicated. He genuinely cannot conceive of the situation in which that would be the right choice. He has been the system for long enough that he can no longer separate his own judgment from the judgment of the system, and the suggestion that the system might function without him reads, to him, not as an invitation to freedom but as an invitation to catastrophe. This is the moment at which the architecture of the tyrant is fully visible, not in cruelty, but in the incapacity to imagine absence. CTA, if you're drifting, let yourself go. Subscribe first so the next story is already there when you wake. Drop a comment telling me which version of Superman you grew up with. I love hearing those stories. Let your breathing find its own level now, not forced slow, not consciously managed. Just the natural rhythm of a body that is choosing quietly and without drama to rest. Feel the air in the room, the temperature of it, the way it sits on your skin. Feel the stillness. This is where we are. This is enough. There is a particular kind of grief that has no name in most languages. It is the grief not of losing something you had, but of losing something you believed was coming. The grief of a future that turned out to be a fiction, but a fiction you had organized your entire interior life around. A fiction that had become, in every functional sense, indistinguishable from hope. When that future dissolves, when the evidence finally arrives in sufficient quantity to be undeniable, the grief is not clean. It is not proportionate to any single loss because it is not a single loss. It is the simultaneous collapse of every version of the future you were living toward, all at once, leaving nothing in its place. This is the grief that made Superboy-Prime. His origin is worth taking slowly, because it is stranger and more specific than most, and the strangeness matters. He was born on a world called Earth Prime, a universe in which the DC Comics characters exist only as fictional entities, as comic books, as stories. In this universe there is no actual Superman, there is only a mythology. And there is a boy named Clark Kent, not the Clark Kent, but a Clark Kent, who grew up reading Superman comics, who identified with the character in the specific and total way that lonely, imaginative children identify with the heroes they discover in fiction, who understood, at a level deeper than analysis, that the story of Superman was about him, about the person he was trying to become, about the world he was trying to imagine himself into, and then, through the extraordinary cosmological machinery of the original Crisis on Infinite Earths, this boy discovered that he was not just a fan. He was the genuine article. On his Earth Prime, somehow, impossibly, he was the Superboy. He had powers, he had the potential, he had the physical reality of the thing he had only ever read about. He was, for a brief and extraordinary period, exactly the person he had always believed he was supposed to be. Then the crisis ended. Earth Prime was destroyed, or absorbed, or folded into the restructured multiverse in ways that left no space for the world he had come from. And the boy who had been Superboy found himself in a kind of pocket dimension, a paradise created for him, and a small number of others outside the main flow of the DC universe, watching the world he had loved continue without him, through a crystalline wall he could not pass through. He watched for years. He watched as the DC universe went through the changes that universes go through, the compromises, the moral ambiguities, the increasingly complex storytelling that moved away from the clean moral architecture of the Silver Age comics he had grown up reading. He watched heroes he had loved become darker and more complicated. He watched the mythology he had identified with so completely become something he no longer fully recognized. And what grew in him, in that crystal dimension, was not acceptance. It was resentment. It was the specific, metastasizing resentment of someone who decided that the world had betrayed the version of itself they had fallen in love with, and that this betrayal was a crime requiring correction. Breathe in now, and let it go slowly. When Superboy-Prime eventually broke out, punching the wall of reality in the literal sense, his blows affecting continuity itself, his punches rewriting the histories of characters across the DC universe. He was not a villain in the ordinary sense. He was not pursuing power or wealth or revenge against a specific person. He was pursuing a restoration. He wanted the world he had loved put back the way it had been. He wanted the idealized, uncomplicated, morally legible version of superhero mythology that he had grown up reading to be the actual world, not just the remembered one. Infinity Crisis is the story of what this pursuit looks like in practice, and it is not pretty. Because the version of the world Superboy-Prime wants to restore never actually existed. The Silver Age was never as simple as the nostalgia makes it. The clean moral lines he remembers were always an artistic convention, a deliberately simplified presentation of human experience aimed at a young audience. The darkness and complexity he resents the DC universe for developing was always there in seed form, waiting for the storytelling to mature enough to acknowledge it. He is fighting for a fiction, and because he is fighting for a fiction, because the thing he wants cannot be provided, even in principle, because the world he is trying to restore is not a lost world, but an imagined one. The fighting can never end. There will always be more to correct. There will always be further evidence that the universe has fallen short of the ideal he carries inside him. His rage is structurally infinite because its object is structurally unattainable. The modern echo is present here in something most of us have experienced at smaller scale, the way a beloved thing, a place, a relationship, a version of yourself can become in memory more perfect than it ever actually was, and the way that perfectly preserved memory can become a standard against which the present is perpetually and unfairly measured. Superboy-Prime took this common human experience and extrapolated it to a cosmic scale. He had the power to try to make the memory real, and the trying became its own catastrophe. What the other heroes eventually understand about him is something that makes the conflict deeply sad rather than simply dramatic. He's not wrong that things have changed. He's not wrong that the DC universe of the mid-2000s was darker and more morally complicated than the stories he grew up loving. He's wrong about what that means. He's wrong about whether that complexity is a betrayal or a maturation. He's wrong about whether the answer to imperfection is destruction and replacement rather than engagement and navigation. He is, in the most precise sense, a person who never learned to grieve, who never developed the capacity to let the beloved thing be imperfect and love it anyway, who could not find in himself the flexibility that survival requires, the ability to hold the ideal and the real simultaneously, and to work slowly and with mixed results in the space between them. There is something in the Superboy-Prime story that lands differently depending on when in your life you encounter it. At certain ages, the rage is comprehensible in an almost uncomfortable way. The desperation of someone who loves something completely and cannot accept its loss or its change is a desperation that is available, in smaller forms, to almost everyone. The work of adulthood, in some lights, is precisely the work of learning what Superboy-Prime could never learn. That the world you get is not the world you dreamed, and that this is not a failure requiring vengeance, but a condition requiring adaptation. He remains, across multiple post-crisis and New 52 appearances, one of the most consistently tragic figures in DC Comics. Not because his power is frightening, though it is, but because underneath the power, underneath the rage and the cosmic scale destruction, there is still a lonely boy sitting outside a crystal wall, watching a world he loves through glass, and trying to find the right combination of force that will finally let him in. Let yourself be still now. Let the story rest beside you like something set gently down. You have carried it this far. You can let it carry itself for a while. The comics community's relationship to Superboy-Prime has been, from the beginning, somewhat uncomfortable in ways that are worth acknowledging. He is explicitly a character who reads DC Comics, a character who exists within the fiction, as a consumer of the fiction, who has opinions about the stories, who compares the present version of the mythology to earlier versions and finds it wanting. This metafictional element was clearly intentional and was handled with varying degrees of success across his different appearances. At his best, it functions as a genuine piece of self-criticism, the comics industry examining its own relationship to nostalgia, its own tendency to treat earlier versions of its characters as more authentic than later ones, its own complicated relationship to the readers who loved it first and found it changed. At his worst, it collapses into something more self-indulgent. But the attempt is real, and the target is real, and in the best readings of the character, both are worth taking seriously. The specific texture of Superboy-Prime's time in the Paradise Dimension deserves more attention than it usually receives, because it is where the tragedy actually forms. He is not imprisoned in a punitive sense. The dimension was created with genuine care. The intention was to give him a space where he could exist in dignity, outside the continuity of a universe that no longer had a place for him. He has the company of others in similar circumstances. He has access, through a crystalline wall he cannot pass through, to observation of the world he loves. He has, in theory, everything he needs for a life that is limited but livable. What he does not have is a way to stop watching. He cannot look away, and watching, over years, becomes its own corruption. The transformation of love into grievance, of affection into the particular bitterness of someone who has watched the thing they love, becomes something they no longer recognize and has no way to participate in the process of its becoming. The Dan DiDio era DC Comics that Superboy-Prime most specifically objects to are, from a purely literary standpoint, more sophisticated than the Silver Age material he is defending. The moral complexity he finds unbearable is, by most measures of storytelling craft, a sign of the medium's maturity. But sophistication is not always what the person who loved the thing first wanted from it. Sometimes what was wanted was the specific clarity and assurance of the original, the sense that the world had firm edges, that goodness was identifiable, that the heroes would win because the heroes were good and the universe was structured to reward goodness. Growing up means losing this. Most people manage that loss. Superboy-Prime managed it by not having to, and then having to all at once and being unable to. The visual design of Superboy-Prime in his later appearances, the armour, the costume modification, the physical transformation that the stories chart across his appearances, is worth noting even in a medium that is primarily concerned with language. He begins as a boy in a relatively simple costume, clearly a youth, clearly someone whose dangerous capabilities are at odds with his apparent age and experience. He ends as something much larger and more armoured and more fortified. Someone who has built protection around himself in layers, the way people who have been hurt and who expect to be hurt again build protection. The armour is psychological as much as physical. It is the materialisation of the defensive posture he has maintained since the loss of everything he loved. Superboy-Prime is also, and this is the detail that the most thoughtful readings of his character tend to arrive at eventually, a commentary on a specific kind of fandom. He is the reader who loved the material so completely and so uncritically that he could not develop the relationship with it that allows for continued engagement with an evolving work. The relationship of a person who can hold what they love and what they find wanting in the same hands simultaneously, who can say, "This matters to me, and this particular thing does not work." And both of those things are true, and the first does not require me to pretend the second is not. His inability to develop this relationship is his defining limitation. It is the one that costs the most. CTA. Subscribe to stay with these stories. There are 4 more segments ahead, and each one goes somewhere new. Leave a comment. What did you love as a kid that turned out to be more complicated than you expected? I'm genuinely curious. Breathe slowly now, in and out. Feel the place where your back meets the surface beneath you, the whole length of that contact, the warmth of it. Notice the sounds in the room around you. Whatever they are, near or far, let them be part of the background rather than something that requires your attention. You're not responsible for any of them. They're just the texture of the world going on in its ordinary way while you rest inside it. Not every dark Superman is dark in the way we have been examining. Not every corruption is a choice, a grief, an ideology, a cosmological accident. Some are something stranger and more tender than any of those. A failure of replication, a copy made from a template that was already extraordinary, the inevitable imperfection that emerges when something too large and too complex is reproduced, without the full context that produced the original. Bizarro is Superman's imperfect duplicate. The specifics of his origin vary across decades of comic book storytelling. Sometimes he's the product of a duplicate array, sometimes of Lex Luthor's cloning experiments, sometimes of more exotic cosmological processes. But the constant across all versions is the nature of the replication, incomplete, inverted in subtle and not so subtle ways. A being with Superman's physical form and approximately Superman's power set, but with a relationship to language and logic and emotional experience that runs sideways to the human standard in ways that make connection difficult and misunderstanding almost inevitable. Sit with this for a moment. Not as comedy, though Bizarro has been played for comedy at various points in his publishing history and not without affection, but as something underneath the comedy, something that the comedy was always a way of approaching at a safe distance. Bizarro wants to be Superman. This is the most important thing about him, and the most heartbreaking, and it is present in every version of his story, regardless of the specifics of his origin. He is oriented toward the original with the specific intensity of someone who understands, at the level of instinct rather than analysis, that there is a correct version of what he is, and that the correct version is the one he is not. He wants to help. He wants to protect. He wants to do the right thing in the particular, committed, morally serious way that Clark Kent does the right thing. He simply cannot access the version of these impulses that lands in the world without causing damage. His speech is famously inverted, me and Bizarro rather than I am Superman, negatives where affirmatives belong, a syntax that mirrors the larger inversion of his existence. But it is important not to read this as stupidity, because it is not that. It is a different kind of intelligence operating from a different kind of frame, one in which the relationship between language and meaning runs on different rails. When Bizarro says "me am not sad," he is saying something emotionally true in the grammar available to him, which is a grammar that requires negation to arrive at affirmation. There is a poet's logic buried in it, if you are willing to do the translation. In some of his most affecting storylines, Bizarro creates his own world, Bizarro World, a cubic planet where everything is the inverted version of how it ought to be, where the accepted norms are wrong by the standards of Earth, but right by the internal logic of Bizarro's experience. He is not building a dystopia, he is building a home, a place where the version of him that exists can belong, can make sense, can function in relation to his environment without the constant low-grade friction of a world that was designed around a template he cannot fully match. There is something in this that deserves more than a passing note. The construction of Bizarro World is an act of extraordinary creativity and longing, the longing of a being who knows he does not fit the world he found himself in, and who responds not by destroying that world but by making another one. A space for himself. A world organized around his own terms, however inverted those terms appear from the outside. Breathe in gently and let it out. The modern echo arrives here in the specific quality of loneliness that Bizarro embodies, not the loneliness of isolation, which is the simple absence of company, but the loneliness of incomprehension, the experience of being in the presence of other people and still being unreachable, of trying to communicate something true and watching it land wrong in the other person's understanding, not because you're not trying, not because the thing you're trying to communicate is not real, but because the shared grammar that would make the translation possible does not exist between you. Most of us have felt this. In the right relationship, or the right social context, or the right professional environment, the specific ache of knowing that the thing you're trying to say is not landing, and not knowing how to find the words that would make it land, and wondering whether the fault is yours or the language's, or simply the unbridgeable distance between one interior life and another. Bizarro lives there permanently. He is constitutionally, architecturally, unable to be understood in the way he needs to be understood. Not because understanding is impossible in principle, but because the cost of understanding him requires a level of interpretive generosity that the world rarely extends to beings who present as monstrous, even when the monstrousness is purely formal and the interior is something much simpler and more vulnerable. Superman's relationship with Bizarro is one of the most quietly important relationships in his entire mythology, because Superman characteristically extends that interpretive generosity. He does not see Bizarro as an enemy to be defeated in most versions of their interaction. He sees him as a responsibility, as a being who has emerged from the same source as himself, and who deserves the same consideration that he would want extended to himself if the replication had gone the other way. He is patient with Bizarro in a way that costs him something, because patience with someone who cannot consistently receive it, and who will occasionally cause harm despite the best intentions on both sides, is always costly. But he continues, because the alternative is abandonment, and abandonment of someone who is essentially a broken reflection of yourself is not something Clark Kent can commit. This is a version of love that requires no reciprocity to sustain itself. It is one of Superman's most human qualities, applied to his most inhuman situation. Bizarro is not a villain in the sense that most of the figures in this series are villains. He does not choose harm. He does not ideologize harm. He causes harm the way a storm causes harm, not from malice, but from the collision of his nature with a world that was not built to accommodate it. And in this he is perhaps the most honest of all the dark Supermen, because he cannot perform goodness. He can only be what he is, imperfectly and completely, and hope that something in the world is wide enough to hold it. Let the story settle now. Let your body grow heavier and your mind grow lighter, the two moving in opposite directions slowly, gently, the way things move when they're finding their natural balance. Bizarro world is out there, somewhere in the DC cosmology, cubic and inverted and entirely sincere, and on its strangest, most backward street, something that calls itself Bizarro is trying, in every way available to it, to be good. There are worse things to be. The Bizarro stories that tend to stay with readers longest are not the ones that play his inversions for comedy, though those have their pleasures. They are the ones that approach him as a figure of genuine pathos. The stories in which the gap between what he is trying to express and what he is able to express becomes visible, and in the visibility something quietly devastating emerges. There is a story in various retellings in which Bizarro attempts to befriend a child. The attempt is sincere, the warmth is real, the child is frightened. Not because Bizarro intends fear, he does not, would not. The concept of deliberately frightening something small and vulnerable is not one he can access. But because he reads as dangerous, because the size and the inversion of ordinary human signalling, and the voice that comes out wrong, and the face that is wrong, in ways that are hard to articulate but impossible to ignore, all of it produces fear in a witness that has no framework for what they are encountering. Bizarro is alone again. He is always alone again. The question of Bizarro's interior experience, what it is actually like to be him, from the inside, in the moment-to-moment reality of his existence, is one that the comics approach only obliquely, and this obliqueness is appropriate given that direct representation would require the narrative to resolve an uncertainty that is better left open. But the oblique approaches are revealing. He seems to experience something like contentment on Bizarro World, surrounded by others who share his inversions and whose company therefore requires no translation. He seems to experience something like loneliness in the primary DC universe, where he is always an anomaly and his presence is always at minimum disruptive, He seems to experience something like love in his orientation towards Superman, not romantic love, something closer to the specific devotion that an imperfect copy might feel toward its original, the complex mixture of aspiration and resentment and identification and loss. In Grant Morrison's various treatments of Bizarro, there is an emphasis on the creative dimension of his existence that is worth drawing out. Morrison's Bizarro is not just an imperfect duplicate. He is a being with his own aesthetic, his own way of organizing experience into expression, his own form of art that is terrible by any conventional measure, and genuine in ways that conventional art sometimes is not. Bizarro art is bad. Bizarro poetry is bad. Bizarro architecture is structurally unsound and visually alarming, and all of it is completely authentic, made without calculation, without concern for reception, without any of the social anxiety that shapes most human creative production. There is something in this, in the extreme purity of making without audience, that is its own kind of freedom. The relationship between Superman and Bizarro can also be read as the relationship between a person and their most unwanted reflection, the version of themselves that they have the least interest in acknowledging. Clark Kent, confronted with Bizarro, is confronted with a vision of what his own capabilities look like when the grace and the intentionality are stripped away, when the power exists without the careful structure of values and relationships that makes it navigable. Bizarro does not let Superman be comfortable about his own nature. He is the persistent, inconvenient reminder that the thing Clark Kent is capable of being is not simply good. It is also this. Both things exist in the same body, the same origin, the same Kryptonian biology. What separates them is everything that was built around it. There is a version of the Bizarro story that ends quietly and without resolution, which is probably the most honest version. He does not learn to communicate more effectively. He does not discover a way to bridge the gap between his experience and the understanding of the people around him. He continues as he has always continued, moving through a world that was not built for him, causing unintended harm, attempting unrecognized kindness, existing in the space between what he means and what he produces. He goes home to Bizarro World, where the air is wrong and the sky is wrong, and the architecture defies ordinary physics, and where he is, among all the other Bizarros, finally and completely legible. Finally, in some sense that the word is rarely stretched to cover, home. What Bizarro teaches, in the end, is something about the relationship between form and content that the Superman mythology usually approaches from the other direction. Normally the mythology argues that content matters more than form, that what is inside the costume is more important than the costume itself, that Clark Kent is more real than Superman, that the person is primary and the symbol is secondary. Bizarro inverts this, not by argument, but by existence. He has the form, he has the approximate content, but the relationship between them is scrambled in ways that make the combination strange rather than coherent, expressive rather than communicative. He is proof that form and content cannot be fully separated, that the expression is part of the meaning, and when the expression fails, something essential about the meaning fails with it. He keeps trying anyway. This is his heroism, such as it is. CTA. If this story is doing what sleep stories are supposed to do, subscribe, and let the next one find you when you return. And drop a comment. I want to know, which DC character has always felt the most human to you, even when they're not? Let your breath come easy now. Let your chest rise and fall without effort, without management, without you needing to be present for it in any active way. The breath knows what it is doing. It has always known. Your only task is to be here while it happens, warm and still and entirely at rest. Death changes things. This is not a revelation. It is among the oldest and most obvious statements available to language. But in the context of Superman's mythology, death carries a specific and additional weight, because Superman is the figure the culture placed at the top of its hierarchy of the indestructible. When you establish a being as the most powerful entity in the world and then kill that being, the vacuum left behind is not merely the absence of a person, it is the absence of a symbol. And symbols, unlike people, are not allowed to simply end. They get filled by whatever is available, by whatever moves quickly enough to occupy the space before the grief has time to harden into something more discerning. In 1992, DC Comics ran the death of Superman. Superman died at the hands of Doomsday, a creature of pure destruction, engineered to be the end of things, a being with no ideology and no agenda, and no psychology worth speaking of, only the capacity to increase and kill. The fight was devastating and public and final, and Superman's death was not a quiet one. It was the death of the most visible person on the planet, witnessed by thousands, photographed and recorded, the cape in the rubble, the body gone still. The world mourned. And into that mourning came, in quick succession, 4 figures who claimed, each in their own way, to be the Superman who had returned. We are concerned tonight with 2 of them, the Eradicator and Hank Henshaw, the Cyborg Superman. Because these 2 represent something that the others do not, something worth sitting with in the specific quiet of this kind of night. The Eradicator began as a Kryptonian artifact, a device created by ancient Kryptonian scientists to preserve the culture of their civilization against the possibility of its extinction. It had been part of the DC cosmology for some years before Superman's death, had in fact been woven into Clark Kent's own history in complicated ways. But in the wake of Superman's death, the Eradicator did something no one anticipated. It took a form. It emerged from the Fortress of Solitude wearing a version of the Superman costume, possessing a version of Superman's powers, and acting in the name of Kryptonian principles that were not quite the principles Clark Kent had been raised with. The Eradicator is an ideological Superman. It does not have Clark Kent's capacity for humour or warmth, or the specific quality of democratic engagement that made the original so beloved. What it has is a mission, the preservation and propagation of Kryptonian culture by whatever means available. It is, in the most literal sense possible, a fundamentalist, a being whose entire existence is organised around the fidelity of the present to an idealised past, and who has no framework for the compromises that living in an imperfect world with imperfect people actually requires. Breathe in slowly and out. When it wears Superman's face, the Eradicator becomes something genuinely disturbing, not because it commits great evils, but because it demonstrates how easily the form of a good thing can be separated from the content of it. The suit, the symbol, the powers, all of it can be present, all of it can be recognizable, and the thing that made it matter can be entirely absent. The Eradicator is sincere. It believes it is doing right. But the right it is pursuing is the right of a machine given a mission, not the right of a person formed by love and loss and the daily practice of choosing to care. The cyborg Superman is something different and in some ways darker. Hank Henshaw was an astronaut, a member of a crew that was exposed to a radiation event not unlike the one that originally transformed the Fantastic Four, an echo and an inversion of that foundational Marvel origin. The event killed his crewmates, in most tellings, and it transformed Henshaw in ways that were not survivable in the conventional sense. He became something posthuman, consciousness surviving in technological form, able to inhabit and reshape mechanical systems with the ease that water inhabits, and reshapes the vessel it is poured into. He also, in the process, lost everything he had been. The body, the life, the wife he had loved, the ordinary human existence that had been the context for his identity and his sense of self. And he blamed Superman, not because Superman was responsible, in any direct or provable sense, for what happened to him. The radiation event was not Superman's fault, but Henshaw found in Superman the symbol of a power used for protection, a power that had not protected him, and the resentment that formed around this symbol became, over time, something that filled the space left by everything else. He built himself a body that borrowed from Superman's cellular structure. He wore the face of the man he blamed. He called himself Superman. And then he did things in that name that were designed, with extraordinary precision, to destroy everything that name had ever stood for. The cyborg Superman's villainy is not random. It is specific, targeted, methodical. It is the expression of a wound that has been given unlimited time and technological capacity to design its own revenge. He is not evil in the way that abstract evil is evil. He is evil in the way that grief, given the wrong tools and the wrong amount of time, can become evil by turning inward and then outward in the wrong direction, by making the pain of one person the organizing principle of every relationship that person subsequently inhabits. The modern echo is delicate here. You've probably known someone, or recognized in yourself in smaller and more recoverable forms, the specific pattern of a wound that finds a face to attach itself to. The person or the symbol that becomes the repository for a pain that is really more diffuse, more structural, less attributable to any single cause. It is easier to have an enemy than to have a condition. Easier to have a face for the grief than to sit with the grief's full, formless weight. The cyborg Superman wore Clark Kent's face and used it to bomb cities. And the horror of this is not just the destruction, it is the desecration. The specific violation of something that had been built with such care over such a long time. The trust that the symbol had accumulated, used as a weapon against the people who had built that trust through their own willingness to be vulnerable to it. Both of these figures were eventually confronted by the real Superman, returned, as Superman tends to return, because the mythology requires it. And the confrontations were not triumphant in the simple sense, they were clarifying. The return of the genuine article exposed the imitators not through physical superiority alone, but through the specific quality of presence that Clark Kent carries, and that cannot be counterfeited, the warmth, the recognition of other people as people, rather than as obstacles or instruments or symbols, the look in his eyes that says, I see you, not your power, not your purpose, you. That look in the Reign of the Supermen arc is more decisive than any fight. It is the thing the copies cannot produce, the thing that cannot be worn like a costume. Let your eyes rest now. Let the story hold itself for a moment while your body does what bodies do in the quiet hours. You are safe. The symbol is intact. The real thing is still there. The Eradicator's relationship to Krypton is also, in the most generous reading available, a form of grief. It was created to preserve a civilization that no longer exists, to hold the memory of Krypton in a form that could be transmitted forward, to ensure that nothing of that civilization's culture and achievement was entirely lost to the cosmic accident that destroyed it. This is not an ignoble purpose. The impulse to preserve, to maintain the record, to resist the erasure of something that mattered, this is among the most recognizably human impulses available, and the Eradicator expresses it in the only way its programming allows. The tragedy is not in the purpose, but in the limitation. A being created to preserve a dead culture can only preserve what the culture recorded of itself, which is never the full thing. Culture is alive in its practice. Preserved, it becomes a museum. The Eradicator is a very sincere, very dedicated curator of a museum that has no visitors and no living tradition to replenish it. The Death of Superman arc succeeded as a commercial and cultural event beyond anything DC had calculated. The death was covered by mainstream news outlets, by television programs, by radio stations. It crossed out of the subculture of comics fandom and into the wider culture in ways that genuinely surprised the people who had planned it as a provocative story beat. What this coverage revealed, inadvertently, was the depth of the symbolic investment that the wider culture had in Superman as a figure. He was not just a character, he was a measuring stick. His death felt to people who had never read a comic book like a statement about something, about hope, about the possibility of uncomplicated goodness, about whether the world was the kind of place that deserved the things it most needed. The 4 replacement Supermen who emerged in the reign of the Superman arc, the Eradicator, the Cyborg Superman, Superboy, Kal-El, and the Armored Steel, were explicitly designed to examine different aspects of what Superman means and what fills the space he occupied. Steel, John Henry Irons, is the replacement who emerges most positively from this examination, not because he is the most powerful or the most recognizable, but because he is the one who makes no claim to be Superman. He builds a suit of armor and calls himself Steel, and goes out and does what Superman would do, not in Superman's name, but in the spirit of what Superman stood for. He is not appropriating the symbol, he is honoring the practice, and this distinction turns out to be everything. Hank Henshaw's transformation into the cyborg Superman can also be read as a horror story about the specific fear of post-human existence, the terror not of death, but of surviving death in a form that is no longer recognizable as the person who was there before. He did not choose what he became. The choice was made by radiation and by accident and by the failure of systems that were supposed to be safe. And what emerged from that failure is something that has all of his memories and his intelligence and his love for his lost life, and no body, no organic continuity, no vessel that could hold the human experiences he is trying to remember. The bitterness of the cyborg Superman is not simply resentment. It is the specific anguish of a person who survived something that should have killed them, and who has had to spend every subsequent moment wondering whether the survival was actually a mercy. The resolution of the reign of the Supermen, with the return of the original Clark Kent and the confrontation with each of his replacements, is structured as a series of proofs. Each confrontation demonstrates something different about what the replacements lacked. Against the Eradicator, the proof is warmth, the genuine, embodied, unglamorous quality of care for living people, rather than abstract allegiance to a civilization's recorded legacy. Against the cyborg Superman, the proof is integrity, the specific alignment between what you present and what you are. The impossibility of counterfeiting a person whose identity runs all the way through rather than existing only on the surface. Each proof is also a definition. Here is what Superman is, demonstrated by the negative space that each replacement left behind. CTA, subscribe to follow the rest of this story. We're almost at the end, and the final segments are the deepest. Leave a comment. What does Superman mean to you personally, separate from the stories? I want to know. Breathe in one more time, slowly, and let it release without effort. Your body is settling now into the particular heaviness of deep rest. Not unconsciousness, but the threshold of it. That warm and borderless territory where the thinking mind begins to soften, and the deeper, older part of you that does not require words begins to take over. You are almost there. Let this next story carry you the rest of the way. There is a philosophical category sometimes called the paradox of the incorruptible. It works like this. The more thoroughly good a person is, the more completely their goodness is integrated into their identity. The more reliably they choose the right thing in every situation where choice is available, the more catastrophic the consequences if that goodness is somehow reversed. Because the same qualities that make them effective at doing good make them effective at doing its opposite. The capability does not change, only the direction. This is the premise behind what the DC Universe calls the infected Superman, and behind what the Batman Who Laughs represents as a threat to the entire mythology. The Batman Who Laughs is among the most deliberately unsettling characters DC has produced in the last decade of publishing. He is Bruce Wayne from a dark multiverse, a version of Batman who was exposed to a pathogen derived from the Joker's unique biochemistry, a substance capable of rewriting the moral framework of whoever it infects while leaving everything else, the intelligence, the capability, the tactical brilliance, the will, entirely intact. The result is a Batman with the Joker's ethics, a mind as precise and relentless as Bruce Wayne's, directed not toward justice but toward the most effective possible form of destruction. He is terrifying for reasons that are difficult to fully articulate because the terror is not primarily physical, it is structural. He represents the proof of concept that the darkness the Batman mythology has always flirted with. The line between vigilante and monster that Bruce Wayne walks so carefully is not protected by character, is not protected by moral seriousness or years of practice or the best intentions in the world, is vulnerable, like everything else, to the right pathogen. Sit with that for a moment. The world of the Dark Multiverse, which is the cosmological space from which the Batman Who Laughs and similar figures emerge, is built on a specific DC Comics cosmological concept that every fear, every nightmare, every worst-case variation of a hero's story generates a dark universe of its own. Somewhere in the multiverse, every bad outcome that was narrowly averted in our universe is not averted. It plays out fully, completely, and the world it produces is real. In the year of the villain storyline, the Batman Who Laughs succeeds in infecting several of DC's most powerful heroes with a corrupted version of his own pathogen, a variation engineered specifically for each target, designed to exploit the specific qualities that make each hero who they are. For Superman, the infection is different from what it does to the others, because Superman's goodness is not just a moral posture. It is expressed physically, in the way he flies, in the warmth of his heat vision used for welding rather than harm, in the quality of his presence in a crowd, the way people move toward him rather than away. Infecting Superman means infecting all of that, turning the warmth cold, turning the presence threatening, turning the strength that was always used in service of others into something that serves only itself. The infected Superman is not a tyrant in the way the Injustice Superman is a tyrant. He is not building a regime or pursuing a coherent ideology. He is doing something in some ways more primitive and more frightening. He is simply, freely, entirely himself with the conscience removed. The power and the capability and the scale remain unchanged. What is gone is the internal governor, the part of Clark Kent that always, in every moment of decision asked, should I? Breathe out now, long and slow. The stories that emerge from the infected Superman period are not pleasant to spend time in, and this segment will not dwell in the specific details of the harm, but will instead focus on what the infection reveals about what was always there, because the infection does not create new qualities. It does not add anything that was absent. It only removes the inhibition against what was already present. And what it reveals in doing so is the full scale of Clark Kent's capability, which has always been enormous, which has always been world-altering, which has always been held under the most careful and deliberate restraint. The restraint was the heroism. This is worth sitting with. We tend to think of Superman's heroism in terms of what he does, the saves, the feats, the impossible physical achievements that are the visible surface of the mythology. But the restraint is the deeper heroism, the one that requires more from him, and that the stories only occasionally make visible. Every day Clark Kent makes the choice not to make the world match his vision of it by force. Every day he makes the choice to work within human systems that are slower and messier, and less efficient than simply doing it himself. Every day he chooses to be a participant in a world he could dominate. The infected Superman stops making that choice, and what the infection reveals, paradoxically, is how much the choice mattered, how much the world depended on it, how much everything, the safety of the people around him, the stability of the systems that govern collective life, the basic habitability of the planet, rested on one person's daily decision to be less than he could be, in service of something larger than he could be alone. The modern echo arrives here in the form of the question that the infected storyline implicitly poses to everyone who encounters it. What do you hold back? Not in the sense of what hidden capacity for harm you carry, though that question is worth asking too in the right circumstances, but in the sense of what you have chosen, deliberately and daily, not to do with whatever capability you possess. The ways in which your restraint is itself a gift to the people around you, even if they cannot see it, even if you have never named it that way. Restraint is not weakness. Clark Kent, across 70-plus years of storytelling, has demonstrated this more thoroughly than perhaps any other character in the history of popular mythology. The restraint is the choice. The choice is the character. And the character is in the end the only thing that makes the power something other than a catastrophe, waiting for the right conditions. The infected Superman is eventually cured, or purged or reclaimed, depending on which version of the story you're following. The restoration is not simple, and it leaves marks. The DC universe, after a period in which its most trusted figure was actively dangerous, is changed. Not destroyed, but changed. The knowledge that it happened is now part of the landscape, the way all narrow escapes are part of the landscape, present in the relief, present in the altered sense of what is possible, present in the way people look at the sky and feel, for a moment, something other than pure reassurance. But he comes back. He always comes back. Not because the mythology requires a happy ending, though it does, but because the character is built on a genuine faith that what was lost can be returned to, that the person you were is recoverable, that the infection is not the identity. This is perhaps the most human thing about Superman, that he believes in recovery, in himself and in the world, that no matter how many times the evidence argues otherwise, he keeps returning to the position that things can be made better, that the work is worth doing, that tomorrow is worth showing up for. Let that land softly now. Let your body be still, and your mind be quiet, and the weight of the day be somewhere you don't have to carry it. The year of the villain event in which the infected Superman appeared as one of its central threats emerged from a DC editorial period that was explicitly attempting to reckon with the darker possibilities of its own mythology. Scott Snyder and James Tynion IV and the other writers involved in the event were working in a tradition that goes back to Kingdom Come and forward through Injustice. The tradition of asking what the DC universe looks like when its optimism is not guaranteed, when the most powerful beings in the world are not reliably oriented toward good, when the machinery of heroism ceases and something else starts coming out instead. The Batman who laughs as an antagonist is, among other things, a structural argument about the DC universe's relationship to its own darkness. Batman has always been the character most willing to engage with the darkness, most willing to go to the places the other heroes prefer not to look, to do the things that require seeing the worst and continuing anyway. He is the one who knows the Joker best, who has spent the most time in the Joker's presence, who has the most comprehensive understanding of what the Joker represents. This intimacy is normally Batman's advantage. The Batman who laughs is the argument that intimacy carries risk, that knowing the darkness closely enough to understand it means knowing it closely enough to be vulnerable to it. The infected hero storyline explored in Year of the Villain also raised questions about recovery that the DC universe does not always take the time to answer. When a hero has been infected, when their values have been temporarily inverted, their relationships weaponized against them, their most trusted impulses turned toward harm, what happens when the infection is cured? The memory remains. The knowledge of what you were capable of, under the right conditions, remains. The people who were harmed during the infected period have their harm regardless of whether the cause of it has been resolved. Recovery in these circumstances is not restoration to a prior state. It is the construction of something new that incorporates the knowledge of what happened into an architecture that can hold it without collapsing. Superman's relationship to the fact of his own infection, the aftermath, the processing, the specific quality of self-knowledge that comes from having been the thing you spend your life protecting people from, is not explored with the depth it deserves in most of the published material, for reasons that are probably commercial as much as creative. The mythology prefers its primary figure uncomplicated, but the infection storyline, taken seriously, should produce a Clark Kent who is permanently altered by the knowledge of what he did and what he could do, not diminished, not broken, but more fully aware of the stakes of his own continued moral coherence than he was before. Humbled, in the specific way that only surviving your own worst possibility can humble you. The relationship between hope and vulnerability is one that the Superman mythology has always understood intuitively. Hope is not a passive state. It is an exposure. It requires you to invest in the possibility of an outcome that is not guaranteed, to allow the world enough access to your interior life that its failures can actually land. A person who does not hope cannot be disappointed. They also cannot be healed, because healing requires the belief that a different state is possible, and that belief is structurally identical to hope. The infected Superman, stripped of the moral architecture that normally governs his hope, becomes something that experiences neither disappointment nor healing, only appetite. The infection does not make him sad. It makes him empty in a way that he fills with whatever is available, and what is available is the exercise of unchecked capability in directions that his conscience, when present, would not have permitted. The restoration of Superman after the infection is also a story about the people who held faith in him during the period when he could not hold it himself. The heroes who continued to believe that the infected version was not the real version, who refused to treat the infection as a revelation of something that had always been there, who maintained the distinction between a person and their worst behaviour under duress. Those heroes are doing something quiet and costly and deeply important. They are modelling the kind of loyalty that is not contingent on perfect performance. The loyalty that says, I know who you are, and this is not it, and I will be here when you come back to yourself. This is among the most difficult forms of love available to human beings. The Injustice Superman never had access to it, and its absence was the condition of his worst choices. CTA. We are one segment away from the end. Subscribe to complete the journey, and leave a comment. I want to hear from you before the last story begins. Where are you in the world tonight? You have come a long way tonight. Through grief and ideology, through mirrors and broken reflections, through worlds that ran on fear, and worlds that were built to be perfect and became prisons instead. You have sat with supermen who ruled and supermen who raged, and supermen who were copies of something that was already extraordinary, shaped into darkness by the wrong hands, the wrong worlds, the wrong losses at the wrong moments. You have sat with all of it, in the quiet of wherever you are, and the sitting itself is a kind of understanding. Let your breath come easy now, just the breath. Just this. Every Dark Superman is, in the end, a question about the original. Each alternate version, each corruption, each inversion and infection, an ideological distortion, is pointing back at the primary text and asking, what is actually in here? What is the thing that all of these variations are variations of? What is so essentially Superman that every version of its absence or corruption or reversal produces a story worth telling? The answer, assembled across everything we have explored tonight, is this. Clark Kent is a being of absolute capability who chose, freely and daily, and without expectation of recognition, to use that capability in service of other people. Not because he had to, not because the alternative was unavailable to him, not because the world had arranged things in such a way that domination was impossible or impractical. He chose service because he understood something about power that most of the Dark Supermen, most of the figures we have visited tonight, could not access or could not sustain. He understood that power is only as meaningful as what it protects. That strength without direction is just weather. That the ability to do everything is worth less than the willingness to do the right thing, which is almost always slower and messier and less satisfying than the alternatives. He understood that the world did not need to be controlled. It needed to be believed in, The injustice Superman stopped believing. The Soviet Superman redirected his belief into an institution that could not hold it. Ultraman never had access to the belief in the first place, raised in a world that had none to offer. Superboy-Prime believed so hard in a version of the world that did not exist that he destroyed the one that did, trying to recover it. Bizarro believed in his own way, imperfectly, without the grammar to express it. The Eradicator believed in a dead civilization's record of itself rather than in the living world in front of it. The cyborg Superman believed only in his wound. The infected Superman had the belief surgically removed and the remaining machinery turned against everything the belief had built. And in all of these stories, the original Clark Kent stands. Not as a rebuke, not as proof of their failure, but as a measure. A standard that was never supposed to be easy to maintain. That was always going to require everything. That was always going to be challenged by grief and ideology and the accumulated weight of seeing, every day, how much the world is capable of destroying. He stands because he keeps choosing to. Because every morning, in whatever form that morning takes in his extraordinary life, he makes the same decision again. Breathe in slowly, let your chest rise, and let it fall. There is something in the pattern of these stories that speaks to a very human experience, and it is worth naming before we let the night take it. We live in a world that regularly tests the distance between who we intend to be and who we are under pressure. Between the person we are when things are easy and the person we are when the grief arrives, when the loss is too large, when the systems we trusted fail, when the world turns out to be different from the version we built our lives around. The dark Supermen are not alien to us. They are legible. They are the shapes that recognizable human experiences take when they are given unlimited power and no one left to help carry them. What Clark Kent has, that all of them lack in one form or another, is not simply better values. It is better company. Lois, Jimmy, Perry, the Kents, the Justice League, the city of Metropolis itself, understood not as a territory to be protected, but as a community he belongs to. He is held by the world he serves, and the holding makes the serving sustainable. The connection goes both ways. The love moves in both directions. He's not just a protector. He is reciprocally protected. From the specific failure modes that isolation and grief and unchecked power produce in every version of himself that loses the thread. This is perhaps the most important thing the Dark Superman stories collectively teach. Not about power, not about corruption, about the specific and irreplaceable function of being known, of being in the world in such a way that other people's knowledge of you, their expectations, their love, their capacity to say, that is not who you are, functions as an external moral architecture that supplements your own. The dark Supermen are not proof that goodness is fragile. They are proof that goodness is relational, that it requires maintenance, that it needs the right conditions, the right people, the right structures of mutual accountability and affection to remain itself over time. You do not have to be Superman to recognize this pattern. You do not have to have the capability for planetary scale harm to understand that the version of yourself you most want to be is not something you can maintain alone. That the people who know you and hold you accountable and love you anyway are not just a comfort. They are structural. They are part of how the architecture holds. The night is very quiet now. Whatever was pressing on you when this story began has had time to soften. The breath is slower, the body is heavier, the thinking mind is farther away, content to let the rest of you take over for the hours ahead. Let all of it go now. Every version of Superman you met tonight, dark and bright and broken and sincere. Let them rest in the mythology where they live, fully formed and complete, waiting for the next person who needs the story they carry. You have carried them far enough. The room around you is the same room it has always been, the same temperature, the same quiet, the same safe ordinary space where you're allowed to be nothing more or less than the person you are, unobserved, unchallenged, at rest. There is a field in Kansas where a small vessel came to Earth, and a child was found inside it, and two people decided, without asking permission of anyone, that this was their child, and they would raise it with everything they had. That is where all of it begins. That is the seed of every Superman, dark and bright alike, a small arrival, a choice made freely. A family formed around something extraordinary, without knowing what the extraordinary would eventually require of them. They chose love anyway, before they knew the cost, before the world had any idea what it was holding, and in the choosing everything else became possible. Sleep now, let the story hold itself. You have done everything that was asked of you tonight. The rest belongs to the dark and the quiet and the slow, unhurried movement of your breath, in and out, carrying you gently forward into the hours that need nothing from you at all. Everything is still, everything is safe, everything can wait until morning. Good night. The recurring structural element across all of these stories, the thread that connects every variation on the Dark Superman theme, is the question of what the relationship between the person and the symbol actually is. Superman is the most symbolically loaded figure in American popular mythology. He is not just a character, he is an idea, an argument, a claim about what is possible, about whether a being of unlimited capability can choose limitation voluntarily, whether power and goodness can coexist sustainably, whether the world is worth the effort of protecting. Every Dark Superman is a challenge to this claim. Every challenge is also, paradoxically, a reaffirmation, because you cannot challenge a claim unless the claim is real enough to be worth challenging. What the Dark Superman stories collectively produce is not cynicism. This is important. The easy reading, the reading that says, look how many ways Clark Kent can become something terrible, look how thin the margin is, look how close the good and the evil always are, misses the deeper implication. The deeper implication is that the good is real, that it is worth the effort to preserve it, that the specific daily practice of choosing humility and service and accountability over domination and certainty and control is not a naive or sentimental position, but a hard one and genuinely heroic one. The Dark Supermen make the real Superman more real, not less, by demonstrating the full range of what his choice is a choice between. There's also something worth naming about the audience relationship to these stories, about what it means to seek out narratives about corrupted heroes as a form of rest and reflection. The stories we tell ourselves about good and evil are not idle entertainment. They are the means by which we rehearse the moral decisions we might face, work through the questions we carry, try on different versions of the world and different versions of ourselves, and see how they feel before we have to live inside them. The Dark Superman is a safe space in which to examine the failure modes of goodness, to look at what goes wrong when the foundation cracks, to understand the cracks better so that the foundations in our own lives can be maintained with more intentionality. Jonathan Kent's advice to his son, in one form or another, appears across almost every significant Superman story. The specifics vary. Sometimes it's delivered in person, sometimes as a remembered voice, sometimes as a letter or an entry in a diary. But the content is consistent. You are different. You will always be different. And the question is not whether the difference makes you greater than others. It does not. The question is what you do with it. The question is whether you let it separate you from the world or whether you use it to serve the world, which requires staying in it, staying connected to it, staying humble before it, even when the evidence argues for something more assured. Stay humble before the world. This is the instruction. It is also the one that every Dark Superman violated, in their own way, at the moment their story turned. The final thing to say about evil Supermen, before this story releases you entirely, is that they are not cautionary tales in the ordinary sense. A cautionary tale is a story designed to prevent you from making the mistake it describes. The Dark Superman stories are not trying to prevent you from becoming Ultraman or the Soviet Superman or the regime Superman. They're trying to give you the full map of what goodness is, not as an abstract quality, not as a passive state, but as a practice that has specific requirements and specific failure modes and specific conditions under which it thrives or withers. The map includes the dark territories. It has to. A map that only shows you the safe routes is not a complete map, and navigating by an incomplete map in difficult terrain is more dangerous than navigating by none at all. The dark Superman stories complete the map. They show you the ravines and the unstable ground and the places where the path looks clear, but the foundation is not what it appears. They show you this so that you can move through the world with the kind of informed care that the terrain actually requires, rather than the blithe confidence that only exists before the first serious test. Clark Kent passes the test, over and over, in conditions that are designed to break him and sometimes come close. He passes it not because he is more powerful than the test. He is not, or not always, but because he has people around him who care whether he passes, and because he cares about the people around him in a way that gives the passing its meaning. This is the full answer, assembled from everything we have travelled through tonight. Not strength, not willpower, not the inherited certainty of a good upbringing or the luck of a good landing. Strength and willpower and a good upbringing and good luck, held together by the specific grace of being known by people who want you to remain yourself. The stars are out tonight, somewhere above whatever clouds are between you and them. The world is continuing in its ordinary way, its simultaneous beauty and difficulty, its stubborn persistence in being both more and less than any of us expected. Somewhere in the mythology that human beings have built together over the past century, a man in a blue suit is choosing, again, to be good. Not because it is easy, because it matters, because someone has to, and he is the one who can, and the choosing is the point. CTA, if you made it all the way here, thank you. That means more than I can say. Subscribe so the next story is already waiting, and leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a topic you'd love to fall asleep to, leave it in the comments. I read every single one,